Hey, how's it going? It's Nick here, and for this video I'm going to be getting ready for really big prints. And so what is really big prints? Well, it's a big kind of week-long printmaking steamroller event where a bunch of artists from across the US get to come together and we're going to print some really big wood blocks with the steamroller. And so I'm pretty excited for this. It's my first time participating. You do have to apply ahead of time if you want to participate, but I think you can just come and watch if you want to. And hey, maybe even next time I'll need some help and you can come help me out. And I thought I'd split this up into a two-part where you get to see me prepare for this project, and then I'll make a follow-up video about the actual event itself. So let's start this wood block. Now, typically to carve, I would prefer linoleum because it holds the fine lines of my detail really well, but really big prints has very specific size requirements for the block. It needs to be 32 inches wide, 60 inches tall, and 3/4 of an inch thick. That way it'll work with their kind of printing jigs, and that way if everyone has the same size block, it'll be easier to kind of drop in and print all of these blocks. And if I wanted to get linoleum to that thickness, I'd have to mount it to a wood base. And if I'm going to spend the money on this wood base that's the same size anyway, I might as well just carve right into that wood base. I'd basically be tripling the price of the project. And so MDF has a few pros and cons. Pros, it's cheaper than linoleum, and it doesn't have wood grain, and I hate carving against wood grain. Now, one of the cons is MDF is rather porous and exorbitive, and so that's what I'm rectifying right here. I'm starting to sand it. Now, because I like to print with a lot of black space, it's going to need a lot of pressure to print that nice and evenly, and I'm going to need that ink to release from the surface really nice and easily. And so to help the ink release from the surface of my block, I'm going to go ahead and sand it all the way up to 2000 grit. It's a little bit excessive, but I really want this to go smoothly while printing. And if you don't sand your MDF, you might have noticed that it kind of has a little bit of a texture when you're printing it, unless you over ink it or you use a ton of pressure. Now, to overcome the porousness of the MDF block, I'm going to go ahead and give it a top layer coat of shellac. And so what this is going to do is basically seal the surface of the block so the ink doesn't kind of get stuck to it. And I feel like it provides a harder top surface for me to carve in, which will help me kind of maintain my fine lines a little bit more without them crumbling away. And after each coat, I'm going to give it a little bit of time to dry, and then I'm going to reapply another coat. And in the end, I'm going to give this about 3 layers of shellac. And once the shellac has dried, I'm going to give it a really thin coat of India ink so I can see what the surface is doing a little bit better. And I'm going to go over it with a pass of this sandpaper right here. And what this is going to do is kind of highlight some of the high spots and the low spots in my shellac application. And so here we can see that I have a little bit of a high spot with the shellac because it's kind of creating this little halo effect when I sand it. And so I'm going to keep sanding this until it becomes a nice uniform kind of look, so I know that I've leveled it out. And I'm going to level out the whole block. And once the whole block has been leveled out nice and perfectly, I'm going to go ahead and apply more India ink until it's nice and pitch black. So for my sketch, I went ahead and did this digitally since I didn't have a piece of sketch paper that was big enough for this. And I'm just going to tape all of these blocks together, and we're going to tape this to the top of my block here. And I'm going to go ahead and use some iron oxide transfer paper to go ahead and transfer kind of the basic ideas of my sketch over to my block. And so basically I set the iron oxide paper face down so that the iron oxide side is touching my block, and then I can draw onto my sketch with a hard thing like a ballpoint pen, and it'll basically transfer those lines to my block. And because this is super smooth and slick that nothing sticks to it, like the ink shouldn't stick to it, my drawing doesn't stick to it very well, so it's going to fade off pretty fast, but that's okay because I'll just keep redrawing it. And I started on this image back around the end of May. It was around Memorial Day weekend when I had just visited the cemetery, and so I had tombstones on my mind. In my head, I have 2 astronauts, and one of them is on fire, and so we're going to light up this scene with the one that is on fire, and he's going to be the main light source for this piece. And so we're going to go ahead and carve him out. And I'm not actually very good at drawing or portraying fire, and so really I'm just going to try and make a white version of smoke, and that's probably the best I'm going to do. And so because this fire is going to have a lot of directional lines and a lot of hatching, it's going to be a very noisy sort of object to portray. And so to have this attached to my astronaut, I'm gonna go ahead and opt to leave a lot of the detail out of the astronaut, at least where the fire is, and that way it can kind of preserve some sort of visual clarity between the two. Otherwise, I feel like this whole astronaut on fire is going to be a little too visually cluttered. It's going to be hard to tell what's going on and to separate the two. I also think it'd be really fun to kind of weave the fire in and out between the limbs and the different facets of the body of the astronaut. And so that's what we're going to go with. Now for the ground, I was originally planning a bunch of grass because I thought the grass texture would be really fun to carve, and it was, but I wasn't quite vibing with the grass. I felt like it wasn't quite bright enough, it wasn't quite kind of grounding enough, even though I thought it could be really fun to do that mark making all the way out into the foreground, and they could have little shadows. So I started carving out the grass, and you'll still see some remnants of it later, but ultimately I didn't like it, and so here you can see I just kind of started clearing out all the grass, and I wanted to make just kind of a big blooming light source just coming off of him. And so that's just an example of how ideas can change over time. I'm never really too stuck to one thing. I'm really just kind of making this up as I go. And so now that I've got a light source established, let's go ahead and jump over to the other astronaut. And so I guess I'm just going to start at the bottom with the foot. And when I make these figures, I really imagine this scene just kind of covered in a fog or a darkness. And I'm slowly starting from the point that's kind of closest to the light source, and I'm just slowly peeling away that fog, and that's kind of how I get this sort of dynamic lighting, dynamic shadows throughout my imagery. And I sort of kind of cover everything with marks, turning it into a sort of midtone, and just kind of step back for a little bit, and things that I think are closer to the light source, I'll go back and brighten them up like I'm doing right here. And for the midtones, oftentimes when I do my hatching, I just kind of space it out in a way that the lines are much closer together, closer to the light source, and then I'll space them a little bit farther apart as I move away from the light source, and that'll kind of give it a little bit of like a tapering, and the illusion that things are getting darker the farther away you're going. Now that I'm finishing up my two little boys here, let's go ahead and take a little paper break. So for my paper, I got a pretty good deal at Hilomi Paper. They had some masa, a whole roll of it, for about $104 I paid for it. And this roll of masa is going to get me about 16 prints. And so not only is it budget, because other rolls of paper would probably cost me around like $160 and I'd only get like 4 or 5 prints out of them. It's also a nice thin paper, which would probably help in transferring the ink on pressure through the block, and rather than getting like, the thick paper like Arch or Reeves or something like that. And since I don't have a cutting mat big enough to kind of span this entire distance, I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can tear it. I got pretty good at tearing paper off the newsprint roll. So I'm just gonna clamp down this straight edge here and give it a little rip. And yeah, that sounded terrible, but hey, it actually came out as a pretty clean edge. So what's the worst that could go wrong? Let's do it again. Yeah, okay, fair. That's what could go wrong. But I got lucky because it tore extra rather than tearing not enough. And so all I had to do is kind of square up this edge. And then let's talk about my real plan for getting all these sheets of paper cut. So since I don't have a cutting mat big enough for this, I'm actually going to be using some chipboard. So this is the stuff that comes on the back of your drawing pads. And so I'm just going to take these and I'm going to tape 2 of them together so I can get a piece long enough for this entire width. And it actually works pretty well as a cutting mat. It just doesn't, last forever. And so once I've got it measured out, I'm going to go ahead and cut this flush. And I'm only going to cut myself 8 sheets of paper. I don't really imagine myself needing more than 8 prints. I'm imagining I'm going to lose 2 of them to test prints anyway. So 6 prints, fine for me. I only ever imagine I'm going to sell like 1 of these, like tops, maybe 2. And then the rest I can just use for trades. So I don't really need to make 16 of these. So I can save the rest of the roll of paper for later. And after I've got it cut, anytime I want to transfer this from surface to surface, I'm going to go ahead and roll it up. That way I don't get any sort of creases or buckles in the paper. And I'm going to have to cut this paper again on the long side because this paper ultimately needs to be 36 inches wide by 64 inches. And so that gives a good 2-inch margin along all the sides. And so this paper that I bought is a 43-inch wide roll. And so we're going to go ahead and trim this down. And once I've got this trimmed down, in order to store my paper and transport it, I'm going to go ahead and roll it up, and I'm going to use a sheet of copy paper, and I'm going to wrap this around my roll and then kind of tape it up, and that way I don't have to put any adhesive onto my nice good paper, but it's still nice and taped closed. And for the other sheets of paper, I'm just going to start rolling them around this one and doing the same thing. And by rolling it and wrapping it this way, I can kind of pull off 1 sheet of paper at a time when I need it, rather than rolling them all together at once. If I rolled all 8 sheets of paper together at once, then I would have to unfurl all 8 sheets whenever I needed them, and so I can keep them all nice and rolled until I need them. Last but not least, I have my handy dandy Alvin kind of carrying tube for my big rolls of paper, and I'm just going to take a little bit of newsprint, kind of put it at the bottom for a little bit of cushion, slide in all 8 sheets of my paper, and then put a little bit more cushion on the top, and we're ready to transport. Now that paper's been taken care of, let's go ahead and finish that carving. And so doing these tombstones and this gas can was probably my favorite part of this entire process, because this is kind of the point where it starts to pull everything together, the entire environment, things start to come into shape, and really fun. The ground, getting to do that lighting and all the cast shadows. It was so very satisfying and rewarding to see it all come together. And with the completion of the tombstones, this piece is pretty much done. I'm probably going to go ahead and round these corners off because I already know that these are going to break off in transit. And so rounded corners, I kind of like the look, and it's going to be looked better than smashed up corners. And I'm going to go ahead and prop this up on its side, and so that way between now and next week, before I just have to go and print this, I can kind of walk past it and tweak things like the lightings and the values and all that stuff. Sometimes you just have to take a step back and go away from a project for a few days and check back up on it, and you'll see things that you didn't like that you can tweak. And so I'm just going to tweak it a little bit between now and next week when I have to print it. And so I'm really excited to print this next week and to see everyone else's prints. And so if you want to see that too, go ahead and subscribe, because I'm also going to put out a video from when I print this and just kind of about the Really Big Prints event in general. So with that, I guess I'll see you next time. Bye!